This conference will now be recorded. This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Coombs, and I'm here with my colleague Thomas DeHope. We're from the American Institutes for Research, and we're presenting on forced displacement in education, our preliminary findings from the FCDO, UNHCR, World Bank, Building the Evidence on Protracted Crisis in Forced Displacement, a multi-stakeholder partnership program. So we're working with FCDO, UNHCR, the World Bank, and colleagues from New York University to tackle the main research questions on forced displacement and measure the effectiveness of programs that are targeting the forcibly displaced, as well as to address pressing policy and theme-specific questions related to education. So far, we have conducted an evidence synthesis to examine the available evidence on the effectiveness of education interventions, the extent to which they facilitate access and retention for displaced students and out-of-school youth, as well as the available information on costs, cost effectiveness, scalability, and replicability of these interventions. As part of this work, we also created a map of interventions to identify those education interventions implemented by governments, international agencies, and NGOs for displaced populations. And we're setting ourselves up to conduct 6 to 8 country case studies to offer an in-depth review of policies and programs that support the inclusion of refugees and internally displaced persons in national education systems. So we've listed here definitions for some key terms that we use so that you can be clear on what we're referring to throughout the presentation, but I won't use this time to go through those now. I would, however, like to start by going over our vision for this project, which is moving from education interventions to education systems. So most of the research that we reviewed focuses on education interventions that are parallel to national education systems rather than through systems, despite the policy emphasis on including refugees and displaced learners in national education systems. We'll go ahead and move on to our specific project, though there are some other considerations here as well. In our theory of change, we came up with this structure which indicates that inputs such as interventions that provide support to administration, infrastructure, and resources, as well as those that target educational content and practices, lead to early term outcomes in terms of 4 domains of change. So that's change at the system level, the community level, the school level, and the individual level, which then would ideally lead to intermediate outcomes on access, quality, and well-being for forcibly displaced populations. And finally, our final outcome, which is improved learning and social cohesion among the displaced and host populations.
Thanks very much, Andy. My name is Thomas DeHope. I'm also at American Institutes for Research. Andy already introduced some of the previous work that we have done, the intervention mapping, the evidence synthesis, and the costing and cost effectiveness analysis, which would then eventually guide us in the next phase of the research, during which we will conduct a desk review, key informant interviews, focus group discussions, and classroom observations in 6 to 8 country case studies that we will select based on the results of the evidence synthesis. In our evidence synthesis, we took a very broad approach. We started by looking for all research on education in emergencies. We included qualitative research. We included quantitative research, both experimental and quasi-experimental studies. And we also included research that included both cost and cost effectiveness information. Like with all systematic reviews, we started with a large number of studies, 6,591. And as you can see in this graph, we eventually ended up with 244 studies, 61 qualitative studies, 1 that are focused on non-interventions, 141 qualitative studies that specifically focused on interventions, and 42 quantitative studies. So what our main findings are actually perhaps more interesting with respect to the evidence gaps. Andy already hinted at that in her previous slides. Most current research focuses on education interventions that run parallel to national education systems, despite the policy emphasis on including refugees and displaced learners in national education systems. There's also limited evidence on the effectiveness of government-supported programs, and there are major evidence gaps on the cost effectiveness of education programs in forced displacement contexts. Nonetheless, the evidence has considerably increased, and a considerable body of qualitative research shows that official policies of inclusion for refugee students often contrast with the practical and social cultural exclusion of these students from educational opportunities and success. We also managed to do some meta-analysis, and those showed that programs emphasizing social and emotional learning have the potential to reduce depression and post-traumatic stress. And a meta-analysis also showed positive effects of technology in education programs on learning outcomes, particularly for out-of-school children. Finally, community-based education in Afghanistan may also be among the most cost-effective interventions in improving access to education and learning outcomes for internally displaced children, and especially if it is possible to transfer community-based education from international NGOs to local governments. Thanks very much. This was our poster.